The book of Joshua recounts how the Israelites, after 40 years of travels in the desert, finally reached their destination, the Promised Land. The book includes some of the more dramatic stories in the Bible, such as Rahab, and the Spies, the crossing of the Jordan River, the conquest of Jericho, and many more. At the same time, it also is a book that has large amounts of violence and describes the eradication of different cities and peoples who dwelt in the land as the Israelites entered. The combination of dramatic stories and the moral problems arising from these stories make for fascinating and challenging reading. And I hope you will enjoy our course on the book of Joshua. Where is the book found in the Bible? So according to the Jewish tradition, the Bible, known as the Tanakh, which is actually an acronym that describes the tripartite division of the Bible. Tanakh, 3 Hebrew letters, Taf, Nun, Chaf, right, stand for the Taf, Torah, first 5 books of Moses, the Nun, Nach, Nevi'im, the prophets, and the third, the Chaf, stands for the Ketuvim, the writings. Joshua is found in the beginning of the Nevi'im, the prophets, and hence right away following the 5 books of Moses, we find the book of Joshua. Also in the Christian Bible, which has a four-part division, we find Joshua in the beginning of the 2nd section, following the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. We find Joshua heading the historical books. This location, on the one hand, right after the Torah, the law, and beginning the historical writings, lends Joshua a unique position in the Bible, and also basically reveals its special status of the book. In fact, the Jewish sages already described how Joshua holds a unique position amongst the books of the Bible. In the Talmud, in Tractate Nedarim, page 22b, we find the following fascinating statement. Rabbi Ada, son of Rabbi Hanina, said, had Israel not sinned, they would have been given the 5 books of the Torah and the book of Joshua alone. Very surprising. In other words, if the Israelites did not sin, we would not have a full Bible. We would just have the Torah and the book of Joshua. Why so? Because it includes the arrangement of the land of Israel, Eretz Israel. Namely, it recounts how the tribes conquered and divided the land amongst themselves. So basically we see that the book of Joshua, in contrast to the rest of the Nach, of the prophets and writings, is actually inevitable. It would have been given even if the Israelites would not have sinned, whereas the rest of the books are just a consequence of sin. Why so? Why is Joshua different from all the other books in the prophets and writings, in the Nach? The answer is because the book of Joshua actually concludes the narrative recounted in the Torah. From the book of Exodus and onwards, we find Moses leading the people on a journey to leave Egypt and reach the Promised Land. But very surprisingly, the book of the Torah doesn't really conclude the narrative because the Israelites don't reach their destination. Moses is informed that he will not enter the land because of his failures. He will die outside of the land, and it will only be Joshua who will enter and bring them into the promised land. And hence, you need the book of Joshua to conclude the Torah. But nevertheless, according to the Jewish tradition, Joshua is not, right, part of the Torah. It is a separate book. Why so? Because the status of the Torah is determined also by the status of the prophet Moses. He is the one who brought the law, right, from God to the people. And therefore, the boundaries of the Torah are basically determined by the boundaries of the life of Moses. And indeed, Moses dies in the final chapter of the Torah. But the story must continue, and Joshua is an inevitable conclusion to that journey. He is the one who will take over from Moses and bring the people into the promised land. It is precisely the content of the book of Joshua and its proximity to the Torah which gave birth in the 19th century to an interesting claim by modern biblical critics, amongst them the Dutch scholar Abraham Kunin and the famous German biblical scholar Julius Wellhausen, who basically claimed that originally the book of Joshua was not an independent book, but rather was part of the Torah. They coined the term hexatoch. Instead of the Pentateuch, the 5 books, Penta, they said, no, there were 6 books, the hexateuch. And the Torah originally included also the book of Joshua, because they couldn't fathom how the Torah could conclude without the conclusion of entering into the promised land. It's an unfinished narrative. And of course, this is counter to the Jewish tradition, which said not the narrative is what determines the boundaries, but rather the prophet himself, Moses, as opposed to Joshua. On the flip side, a little later in the 20th century, another German scholar by the name of Martin Noth actually came up with a theory which went in the other direction. And he said there's not a hexateuch nor even a pentateuch, but rather there was a tetratuch. It was only the first 4 books which comprised the Torah originally. The first 4 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And from then on began a separate work, which was the Deuteronomistic history. Namely, they said that Joshua is the second part of the Deuteronomistic work, which began with the book of Deuteronomy. What led to this position, which is quite widely held in modern academic biblical circles? Well, the close parallels in language and in form that we find between Deuteronomy and Joshua and the continuation of the historical books, namely the usage of speeches, hortatory speeches that stress motivation and commitment to God, which we find in Deuteronomy, as well as in the book of Joshua, in its beginning and end. And hence, we can say that there were 3 positions. There's the traditional position of a Pentateuch and Joshua beginning the rest of the Bible, the historical books, the prophets. And we have the position of a hexateuch, where the book of Joshua is part of the Torah, the conclusion of the Torah. And we have a third position that the Torah actually only includes originally 4 books, and Deuteronomy is the beginning of a larger work which encompasses the history of the Israelite people. In any event, as we said, in the Jewish tradition, in the Bibles, and also for that matter in Christian tradition, There is the Torah, the Pentateuch, and it is separate from Joshua, but Joshua, of course, holds a special status because of its content as concluding the narrative that is begun in the Torah itself. The structure of the book of Joshua. The book can be broken down into three major parts. The first part, spanning chapters 1 to 12, probably the most famous, is the account of the entrance and conquest of the land. Chapter 12 summarizes that conquest and has a list of the different kings that were conquered by Joshua. The second part, from chapters 13 to chapter 22, describes the allocation of the land and its settlement. And finally, the last two chapters, chapters 23 and 24, have two speeches, departing speeches, concluding speeches by Joshua, in which he encourages the people and warns them if they will disobey and stop following God. So the book is basically framed by speeches, where chapter 1 is actually also a speech by God encouraging Joshua in his first steps as a leader, and concludes with Joshua's speeches in the final two chapters of the book. And this was, of course, what led to the theory that Joshua is intricately connected to the book of Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomist history because of the use of many speeches, as we mentioned earlier. So, who wrote this book of Joshua, and when was it composed? The first to raise this question and propose an answer were once again the Jewish sages of the Talmud. The Talmud, the book that was composed between the 3rd and the 5th century. So we find in Tractate Baba Vatra, page 15, first side, the following treatment of that question. Joshua wrote his book, but then they question this proposal. But isn't it written, and Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died? We find in the final chapter the mention of the death of Joshua. So it's unlikely that Joshua describes his death. The sages answer, Eleazar completed it. Eleazar, son of Aaron the high priest, the one who inherited that position in the time of Joshua, he's the one who completed it, namely that statement about Joshua's death. But then the Gemara, the Talmud asks again, but isn't it also written, and Eleazar, son of Aaron, died? Answer, Pinchas completed it. Pinchas, the son of Eleazar. So we see here the identification of the author of the book as Joshua himself, where certain verses describing the death of Joshua and the death of Eleazar are then later attributed to others who simply completed the book. If we analyze this source, it seems to be evident that there's no real tradition or certainty about the authorship of the book of Joshua, just like in general, there's no real certainty about the authorship of the books of the Bible. And this is proposed as a possibility and then challenged based on logic, and therefore, and then alternative answers are proposed. But the major position is that Joshua is the author of the book. This position was challenged, and the first to challenge it is actually another rabbinic author by the name of Abarbanel. Don Isaac Abarbanel lived in the 15th century and the beginning of the 16th century. He's a Jewish Portuguese Bible commentator, philosopher, also a statesman and a financier, a brilliant man, great knowledge in many areas, very talented. He was born in Lisbon, in Portugal, rose to prominence there, but eventually had to flee from Portugal to Spain, and there served the king there in basically in charge of the economy. And he also, in that period, under Ferdinand and Isabel, attempted unsuccessfully to prevent the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. He eventually was expelled, moved to Italy, where once again his talents were recognized, and he was elevated to be basically in charge of the economy, the Minister of Finance there. He passed away in Italy, in Venice. In any event, Abarbanel wrote an interpretation to the Torah as well as to the Bible, and in his introduction to the former prophets, which is also the introduction to the book of Joshua, he deals with the question of the authorship of the book of Joshua and its original attribution by the sages to Joshua. And he questions that. But he doesn't only question it because of those final verses describing the death of Joshua and the death of Eleazar, but he says there's another reason, which makes him believe that the book was written well later, and that is the repetition of a term in different places in the book of Joshua, which hints that the book was written well after the time of Joshua. And that is the term ad hayom hazeh, translated unto this day here, as you can see. Here's one example. In Joshua chapter 4, after crossing the Jordan, Joshua sets up 12 stones. And we're informed that these 12 stones, right, are there to this day, and to this day. Now, that term unto this day, which appears also in other places, implies that a long time has passed since those events. And hence, in Abarbanel's opinion, the book was written after the period of Joshua, after the time of Joshua, and therefore he rejects that attribution and has an alternative. According to the Abarbanel, the book was not written by Joshua, but rather it was composed by the prophet Samuel. You could see, I don't have a translation of the book, but here he summarizes his position after inquiring and reading the book, he saw that the sages believed that it was written by Joshua, but then he says, we see the questions were asked, and hence there's no real tradition, and therefore he comes to the conclusion that it was Samuel, who wrote the book as found in his introduction to the prophets. This was also the position of 16th century European scholars such as John Calvin, Thomas Hobbes, who also believed that the book was not written by Joshua, but rather was written quite later. As far as modern scholarship is concerned, it's generally accepted that the book developed in stages, different periods, where most scholars believe that the first stage of the authorship of the book was in the late 7th century, time of King Hosea, Yoshiao. And in that time, the book used perhaps older narratives and traditions about narratives, and then was composed. And then at a later stage in the 6th century, there was a Deuteronomistic editing and redaction of the book to include other sections, including the speeches and using different materials that had a lot of geographic information to complete the book. That's mainstream biblical scholarship today. Of course, this is more speculation. We don't have hard evidence about the authorship and stages of the development of the book of Joshua. What we can say, and that's clear based on the text that we have, is that the book is structured and very well organized. Like I said, we have the conquest, and it's you see the flow from narrative to narrative, where the earlier narratives give the background information necessary for the later narratives. And it's a well-integrated story. For example, the story of Rahav and the spies in the 2nd chapter sets the background to the conquest of Jericho in chapter 6 and the saving of Rahav and her family. The story of the conquest of Jericho and eventually the Ai leads to a reaction of fear amongst the residents of the land, and that leads to a peace, an attempt to strike peace by the Givonites, and that in itself leads to a response of war by the southern kings, so that you can see that the narrative is structured as each stage leading to the next one with the information necessary provided earlier. So we can see like a real narrative formation. So it's hard to see how these narratives were independent. It seems like it's a well-integrated story, and hence it seems like there was maybe an original book of conquest which existed and later used and then eventually expanded to include other materials by later editors. So that's in relation to the question of the authorship. Like we said, the traditional first attribution to Joshua, some later more critical thinkers, including Abarbanel, Calvin, Hobbes, who thought it was written later, Abarbanel suggesting the prophet Samuel, and modern scholarship's position, as they usually hold, that the books were gradual in stages developed and included stages of redaction until the final stage. Another issue which has arisen in modern scholarship is the question of the historicity of the events recounted in the book of Joshua. And this has arisen primarily in light of archaeological findings related to the stories of Joshua. The primary focus of tension revolves around Jericho itself, where we have a quite definite identification of the location, and the archaeological digs, the many digs that have taken place in Jericho, have led to questions as far as the chronology. When was Jericho destroyed? And this is an issue which we will deal with when we will analyze the story of the conquest of Jericho. In any event, what's very important to emphasize is that it's not really correct to view the book of Joshua, and for that matter, the Bible in general, as a book of history. The biblical books were not written to teach history. They use history to get to their theological, religious, ideological messages. And hence, the analysis of the book of Joshua and other books of the Bible is primarily focused on understanding what the message of the biblical authors was. What were they trying to get to? And for that, we have to approach the book as literature and analyze and try to understand the meaning behind the different narratives. And another issue, which is particularly acute, of course, for modern readers, is how to grapple morally with the whole description of the conquest, the violence, and the eradication of cities and peoples. This would be something parallel to an act of genocide, and would be viewed as a war crime. And hence, a modern reader has to grapple with these issues, and we will indeed deal with this and try to see how we can approach it from a moral perspective when we reach the stages of the beginning of the conquest. What I want to conclude with is the star of the book of Joshua, and that is, of course, the character of Joshua. Joshua is a central character, and hence, not surprisingly and very appropriately, the book is called the Book of Joshua. So we know that Joshua inherited the position of Moses as a leader of the Israelites. And this was indeed quite a seamless, natural transition of power. And this occurred to a large extent because Moses was concerned to have someone take over his position once he was informed by God that he would not bring the people over into the land. And also, it is God who elected Joshua. And indeed, one can say that Joshua is one of the most, if not the most successful leader in the biblical account. But what made Joshua the right man for the job? What do we know about Joshua in the Torah prior to the book of Joshua? So Joshua is mentioned already quite early, right after the Exodus from Egypt, in quite a, we can say, a dramatic and pivotal event. After the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, in that miraculous event, they were attacked. And they were attacked by none other than the Amalekites. Then came Amalek and fought with Israel in Rephidim. This is Exodus, Shmot, Exodus 17, from verse 8 and onwards. So the Amalekites surprised attack the Israelites. What will Moses do now? In this instance, there's nothing of an incredible miracle like we find at the Red Sea, but rather, and Moses said to Joshua, choose us out men and go out, fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. So Joshua did as Moses had said to him and fought with Amalek. And we read on at the end that this was a successful battle, and Joshua weakened, Amalek by Achalosh Yoshua, weakened Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. So what can we infer from this event? Well, it's clear that Joshua is the commander of the army. He's a military commander, and a successful one at that. He was already elected at this early stage, right after the Exodus from Egypt, to lead the Israelites in battle against the formidable Amalekites, right? An important enemy, which we will hear later on also in the Bible. So we know that he has military prowess and capacity. What else do we know about Joshua? So in Exodus 24, where Moses goes up to Mount Sinai, we are informed, and Moses rose up, and Joshua, his servant, Meshalto, his servant, and Moses went up into the mountain of God. We know that Joshua went up with Moses onto Mount Sinai, which is very interesting. This is not a military event. Rather, he's going up in a very spiritual event to receive the Torah. Of course, Joshua doesn't go up to the top, but he's on the mountain because we know when he comes down, because of the sin of the golden calf. On the way down, Moses meets Joshua, and he hears the noise. Joshua thinks there's a war going on, and Moses tells him, no, it's not a war. It's just partying and frolicking and misbehavior. But we know that, interestingly enough, Joshua went up with Moses to the mountain, to Mount Sinai. Once again, we have a general description of the relationship between Moses and Joshua. This again in Exodus, this time Exodus 33. The previous one was Exodus 24. We read in Exodus 33, verse 11, and the Lord spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend, and he would return into the camp. But his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, departed not out of the tent. So here we see a description of Joshua as a student of Moses in the tent, learning from him. Very different from the depiction we had in the book of Exodus, where he's the military leader. Here he seems to be the pupil, scholar, student of Moses, a spiritual man, just like when he went up to the Mount Sinai. Of course, perhaps the most famous and extended mention of Joshua in the Torah is the story of the spies sent by Moses. In the book of Numbers, the story begins in chapter 13, where the spies are sent, and we're informed that one from each tribe, and Joshua is sent to represent the tribe of Ephraim. Ephraim, one of the northern tribes. It's interesting because Joshua is a northern leader, but the book of Joshua actually has quite a background of a southern background with a lot of information about the southern conquest and cities in the area. So on the one hand, we have a northern leader, perhaps a hero of the northern tribes, but with a venue of composition, which probably is in Judea, in light of a lot of the information, at least the later stages, perhaps, of the writing. But in any event, he is from the tribe of Ephraim. When he was sent, his name was changed. His name was originally Hoshea, and it was changed to Yehoshua. The letter Yud was added. And this letter Yud, right, J pronounced in English, Joshua, Yehoshua, I think represents like a spiritual kind of blessing upon Joshua. So he was sent with the other spies, and we know what happened. That was, of course, a dramatic turn of events where the spies basically dissuaded the Israelites their capacity to conquer the land. They didn't believe that they could do it, right? And then and after hearing that, the Israelites rebelled, and all the congregation lifted up their voice and cried, and the people wept that night. And all the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, would we that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would we had died in the wilderness? They would have preferred dying. And where does the Lord bring us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will be a prey. Were it not better for us to return to Egypt? And they said one to another, let us make a captain and let us return to Egypt. You see a total rebellion. They're turning their backs on the whole Exodus after they heard the report of the spies. Then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all the assembly of the congregation of the children of Israel. Moses and Aaron don't even know what to do and how to react to this. But there are 2 out of the 12 spies who reacted differently. And Joshua, the son of Nun, and Caleb, the son of Yefuneh, who were of them that spied out of the land, rent their clothes. And they spoke to all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, the land which we passed through to spy it out is an exceedingly good land. And if the Lord desires us, that's I prefer, he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only rebel not against the Lord, neither fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their defense is removed from over them. and the Lord is with us. Fear them not. So we see here that while the 10 out of the 12 spies did not believe in the possibility of conquering the land, 2 did. Caleb from the tribe of Judah and Joshua from the tribe of Ephraim. And of course, this story spreads a lot of light on the character of Joshua, his faith in God, his belief in the capacity to conquer the land. But if we summarize what we've seen about Joshua in the Torah, seems to be kind of a dichotomy. On the one hand, we have some descriptions of him as a military leader. He's successful in leading the army against the Amalekites. He's also a successful spy with a lot of faith in their capacity, confidence in the capacity to overcome the enemy. So that's maybe Joshua, the military leader. But on the flip side, we saw him as the student of Moses in the tent, the one who goes up the mountain with Moses to Mount Sinai. So what is the real Joshua? Who is the real Joshua? Is he a military, powerful leader? Or is he a scholar, student, disciple of Moses? Some modern critics who think very in a linear and dichotomic manner, who think that a person can only have one, characteristic, said that there are different traditions and sources about Joshua. However, it's quite evident that the Bible describes more complex characters. And if we can summarize the information we have about Joshua, we can say that we have here both a military and a spiritual leader. And if we return to our question, what made Joshua the right man for the job? Why did God elect Joshua? Well, I think the answer is very clear. What's required of a leader, at this time, to bring the people of Israel into the land and to successfully conquer the land? And what is required for that successful mission? Well, you need both power, military prowess and capability, as well as spiritual depth and leadership. And that is exactly what we find in the character of Joshua. And hence, not surprisingly, when Moses was informed in the book of Numbers, chapter 27, verse 12 and onwards, and the Lord said to Moses, "Get up the mountain of Abarim and behold the land which I have given to the children of Israel. And when you see it, you shall be gathered unto your people, as Aaron, your brother, was gathered." In other words, you will pass away, because you rebelled against my commandment in the wilderness of Sin, etc. So Moses is informed that he will not enter the land and he was about to die. How does Moses react? And Moses spoke to the Lord, saying, "Let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, set a man over the congregation, who may go out before them and who may come in before them, and who may lead them out and who may bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord be not as sheep which have no shepherd." Notice the greatness of Moses when he's tragically informed that, he will not enter the land. His whole dream of seeing the promised land, he doesn't feel dejected and fall into depression and moan his difficult fate. Rather, what is his concern? The future of the people. And he asks, who's going to lead the people? Don't leave them without a leader. And what is God's response? And the Lord said to Moses, "Take you the Joshua, the son of Nun, a man in whom is spirit, and lay thy hand upon him." Joshua is the one who's determined to be the leader. And why? Because he is a man in whom there is spirit. He has faith, he has power, he has belief. And this lends him both military prowess and spiritual prowess. Those are the ingredients necessary for the leader who will bring the people into the promised land.